My name's Jenna. I'm from Omaha, Nebraska, and I'm studying elementary education right now. I am in my student teaching experience in a 5th grade classroom at Elliott Elementary. And for my competency statement, I really started with the theme of theories of learning and their roles in teaching. And I went from this theme and really thought about what kind of questions I have. And that's where I created my guiding questions, which then led me to develop a competency statement. So for my guiding questions, my very first one, how can a teacher motivate students? And I picked this question because I noticed it came up quite often in my practicums and my student teaching experience. We are really trying to get students to be motivated in their work and want to learn. So that's how I developed that guiding question. My second guiding question is, how can giving students choices promote responsibility? I kind of developed this from the idea of, as teachers, we're teaching curriculum, but we're also teaching students how to be responsible, kind human beings. And then my last guiding question is, how do I share power with my students? And this question came from the chapter that I'll talk about later, from Love and Logic, about shared control and providing students with choices. And so the shared control and shared power of that classroom, really that chapter started my thinking on, how can I do that? How can I have that in my classroom? So today I'm going to be telling you about my growth through this process to arrive at my competency, and then I will be talking about my ahas or my synthesis, the big things I took away, and then I have my reflection and how I'm going to go about continuing this and improving on it in the future. So for my first artifact, where I wasn't quite competent yet, I have my very first lesson plan ever from my very first practicum, and it was a lesson on singular and plural nouns. And I was so excited. I had cut out 2 tree trunks. One said singular, one said plural. There were leaves, and on every leaf was a noun, and students were given a leaf and they had to figure out what trunk to put it on. I was so excited for this lesson. I spent so much time on it, and overall it went pretty well, but the students weren't as motivated to participate in this lesson as I thought they were going to be, as I wanted them to be. So I really reflected on what I could change to make them just as excited as I was on that very first lesson. So what I didn't have on this lesson plan were choices. There was no choice. There was always a right or a wrong. There was always a stand up now, sit down now, get out your pencil now. There was very structured. There wasn't a lot of freedom. And that was in a 3rd grade classroom, but it still could have used more choices. This leads me into my second artifact or piece of evidence, which I came to from reading this chapter of Love and Logic. This all is from my my 3rd practicum, my lip block practicum. I was in a 2nd grade classroom at Elliott Elementary, and we got to read Love and Logic, and this whole chapter was about shared control, shared power, providing students with reasonable choices to make sure students feel in control and just lead students to do the right thing, but also have those choices. What I really loved about the idea of choices is it not only shared the power with students, but it also provided students with an opportunity to be responsible for their own learning. And with this responsibility came motivation. So my example, this picture right here, is about from a guided reading lesson. There was a station on vocabulary, and they typically wrote meaningful sentences using each vocabulary word, and I decided to do something creative and different, creative kind of in this tree way, but creative nonetheless. But this time I offered much more choice. They had the choice in what color strip to use. I had an example of a rainbow, and on each strip they wrote a meaningful sentence, and the only direction was you have to have 4 strips of paper. Any color you want, any order you want. And what I noticed is students were incredibly motivated at this station. This was independent work, and they were still really into it. because they had that small choice of color, but that small choice was really meaningful to them. They also had the choice of how to order it. And what I noticed along with the motivation is they wanted to do more to make a better rainbow. So even though they were only required to do 4 sentences, many of them did 5 or 6 because they thought their rainbow looked prettier. So that student choice really motivated them, and they took responsibility for their learning, their lesson, and that was wonderful. So this leads me into my third artifact or piece of evidence. And this is from my student teaching experience, which has been an absolute blessing because my teacher is very big on restorative practices. And restorative practices is all about how you run your classroom. So restorative practices, just a quick little bit of information about it, is about building such a strong community in different ways, having the classroom set up in a circle, building a strong community through transparency, just having such a strong community that when problems do arise, you just repair relationships instead of punish students. And I loved that, and I was also given by her several readings to do about restorative practices. So this diagram is from a restorative practice book about the fundamentals. So this shows the 4 fundamentals. I know it's kind of hard to see, but the highlighted part is shared agreements and shared accountability. And since that's one of the fundamentals, I really started thinking about what else that reminded me of, and it reminded me of the shared control, the shared power of the Love and Logic chapter. So knowing that restorative practices is really heavily focused on community building, I knew that the choices that I was giving students was sharing that responsibility and power with them was also reinforcing a strong community. So this leads me into adding choices into my lesson as I was doing here, but having more choices and trying to make them more meaningful to the students. So everything highlighted is a choice the students had. This lesson plan is from a whole group reading lesson where the comprehension skill was asking and answering questions. It has some elements of restorative practices, like we begin with kind of a little circle question and we end with a circle. So it's wonderful in that sense, but each highlighted part is a different choice the students had. It was anything from a simple pick a sticky note color to what pages should we read today, to answer this question with a partner or by yourself. There was so much student choice in this lesson that I noticed students were much more motivated about this lesson than the students were from this lesson. I was excited about both lessons equally, but when I implemented more student choice and student responsibility for their own learning, I noticed more motivation, the motivation I really wanted from this first lesson but didn't quite get. So I loved having student motivation here, and that connects to how can a teacher motivate students? Well, with choices, as the Love and Logic chapter described, and how can giving students choices promote responsibility and having them be responsible for their learning? Everyone was participating in this activity. Everyone completed the sticky note activity. They were responsible for their learning because they were given those choices. And how do I share power with my students? Well, through choices here and simple choices there. But these choices also are important for sharing power, for building a stronger community where students are responsible for making the right choices for their education because they know how they learn best. So my synthesis or my aha moments, I have 2 big ones that stand out. It's important to share power with students, and this can be done by giving them choices. And this I emphasize throughout the whole demonstration of my growth, but these choices aren't just to have them feel in control, because these choices are also important to them. And that leads me into kind of my second synthesis big aha, is that it's important for students to have choices. Students are always making a choice, so if you're able to provide them with 2 options where you're okay with either option, then you're going to get a better outcome. Students always have the choice whether to be engaged or not engaged. Students always have the choice whether to be disruptive or focused. And so by providing these very meaningful, valuable choices to them, you limit these choices that you might not want to see in your classroom. So giving students choices is important because it does motivate students. You see the motivation, I saw the motivation in this lesson plan in comparison to this lesson plan where there wasn't a lot of motivation because there wasn't a lot of student freedom or student choice. Here there was more. Giving choices also promotes responsibility. Here they were responsible for their own learning. No one had to redo this because they knew what they needed to do. They were responsible in this moment as second graders. Here they were responsible. They all finished their sticky note activity, and that was wonderful. So what I learned from this whole process, my reflection, what I learned is that I can be a teacher who shares power. I think that's a very daunting task for many teachers. They don't want to give up that power, but that I learned I can be okay giving my students power so they build a great, strong community. I also learned that students love choices. Whether it is a simple choice, lights on, lights off, students love to be an active part of their community. A limitation to my competency statement of I am competent at providing choices in the classroom in order to reinforce a community which promotes student responsibility is that students don't always get a choice. There are some things students just have to do. You can't compromise on that as an educator. And I've thought about this and thought, okay, but if I'm providing my students with so many other choices, when it comes time for students to have to do something, they won't be as quick to rebel because they've had a say. They know that I value their opinion and that it's important to me. So I still need to improve on varying the types of choices I give them, from small choices to more meaningful choices. And to improve on that, I plan on exploring through my own lesson plans the different choices I can give students to have them be more motivated through different types of choices, and then also observing colleagues and how they add choices, as well as going to professional development on either shared control or restorative practices would really lead me into figuring out how to provide choices for students that do reinforce a community and promote that responsibility. Okay, so to sum it all up, I demonstrated how my guiding questions go under the theme, and from these guiding questions, I created a competency statement, and then I demonstrated with these 3 pieces of evidence or artifacts my growth from not yet competent to competent, and then I had my big ahas from reflecting on the growth and the reflection on the growth and how I will use that in the future. Are there any questions?